Welcome to Wicked Crime, a Massachusetts true crime podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and I'm back with episode 22, technically the first episode of season 3, sort of the second episode because of the Danny Croto one, but here we are. And today I have for you, as promised, a very well-known case from my neck of the woods out here in Western Mass. A case that until 2017 went unsolved for 25 years, and that is the murder of Lisa Ziegert from Agawam. I think this case might be fairly well known outside of Western Mass as well, just because it remained unsolved for so long and then finally got solved after 25 years. And it gives hope to these cases that we see that have never been solved after such a long time, because I think when so much time passes, like decades upon decades, it's really easy for people to lose hope and for family members to think that they're never going to get answers, but sometimes that's just not the case, and that is the same with Lisa and also with Danny and many other cases out there. So Lisa Ziegert was a 24-year-old woman who lived in Agawam, and she was a teacher's aide at the middle school, and she also worked weekday nights from 5 to 9 p.m. at this little store called Brittany's Card and Gift Shop, which isn't around anymore. Possibly because of what happened there, but I have no idea if that's for certain. Lisa was known to be very kind and popular with her friends, and she wanted to be a special ed teacher, so you can only imagine that she was someone who had a lot of compassion for others. So it was April 15th, 1992, and by all accounts, Lisa had a very normal day. She went to teach, she got out at 4:30, and then headed over to Brittany's to work. During the majority of Lisa's shift, there is definitely proof that she was there and that it was business as usual. According to Chilling Crimes, her sister Lynn was there hanging out with her from 5:30 to 6 p.m., and she said everything was normal. Later on in the investigation, a customer told police that they were in there at 8:20 at night, and they made a purchase from Lisa where, once again, everything seemed pretty normal. And they were able to confirm this transaction by going back and looking at the receipts from that day. But between this customer coming in and mostly around like 9 p.m. at night, something really terrible happened to Lisa. The next morning, Lisa's coworker, Sophia Maynard, arrived at Brittany's at 8:45 a.m. to open the gift shop, and when she got there, she was confused because Lisa's car was in the parking lot, which wouldn't have been normal since she should have been at school. But Sophia figured that maybe she was just there to help with balloon stuffing. And when she walked in, though, not only was the door open, but the lights were on and the music was still playing, which definitely was not normal. But she thought that Lisa was there, and so she tried to call out for her, but there was no answer. She wasn't anywhere in the gift shop. But when Sophia saw that all of Lisa's stuff was still there, like her purse, her keys, her drawings, she knew something was wrong. Plus, there was still money in the register from the night before, and obviously that shouldn't have been there. So when she realized this, she ran across the street to a restaurant to call the police, as it was 1992 and she didn't have a cell phone. Once police get there, they look everything over in the gift shop, and they do find evidence that there was some kind of struggle. But there really wasn't much to go on. In the back room at Brittany's, they found a few traces of blood, some scuff marks in the ground where someone might have been dragged into or out of the room, boxes that were flattened as if someone had fallen and was laid on top of them, and it looked like the door might have been kicked in. But besides that, there was nothing. On top of it, Lisa's parents learned that she hadn't shown up at school that morning, so this was obviously a bad situation. Police started asking around if anyone had any information about her whereabouts, but not much turned up there either. Besides a customer who came in Brittany's at 8:20 p.m. the night before, like I said, there was also another customer who claimed to have gotten to the gift shop around 9 p.m., but no one was in there. They claimed to have heard muffling noises in the back room, but when no one came out after a few minutes, they left. On the Unsolved Mysteries blog, the customer described it as sounding like a banging noise. It's entirely possible that this was Lisa and her attacker in the back room. And I'm pretty sure they touched on this in the Crime Junkie podcast episode on this case, but you can only imagine how someone must have felt that night, because they might have been able to save Lisa's life, this customer. And I guess it's not a bad idea to call for help if you feel something isn't right, but it's also like, well, am I supposed to call the cops every time someone looks a little fishy? Probably not. And we also don't know for certain if it was Lisa and her attacker in the back room, or maybe just Lisa doing something back there and she didn't know someone came into the store. So what exactly happened to Lisa? Obviously, her family is very worried at this point, and the cops are looking for leads, and they get tips about what might have happened to her that night. One being from a woman who was driving by Brittany's around like 9:15 p.m. and claimed to see a man and a woman struggling in the backseat of a car, which would fit the timeline potentially. According to Unsolved Mysteries, the woman thought it was just some teenagers messing around, so she didn't really think anything of it. But she did see the car driving off towards a wooded area. But it doesn't seem like anything comes from that either. What's also interesting to note is that Lisa's friends and family remember hearing her talk about feeling like she had been watched for a while before she disappeared. And she had no idea who was watching her, and she just had that like weird feeling that you get sometimes, I guess. And so it wasn't like the police had anything to go off of with that, because she had no idea who it was, and no one in her family had any idea who could have been creeping her out like that. But 4 days later on Easter Sunday, a man and his dog discovered Lisa's body in the woods off of Route 75. And it was pretty off the beaten path, so not somewhere that people walked frequently. According to the Dateline episode on the case, which I highly recommend you watch, and you can find the link to that on my website at wickedxcrime.wordpress.com, it had rained and snowed for 3 days before Lisa was finally found, which really isn't ideal for gathering evidence, but police tried to be careful when going to the scene, and they walked in each other's footprints to try and not disturb too much and not have too many footprints everywhere so they could determine any other ones they found, because they did find tracks that they figured were from Lisa's killer. When they found Lisa's body, it was pretty clear that she was a victim of sexual assault before they even tested for that. Her boots were off and she was partially clad with her clothing pulled down. Her hands were cut up, and that's like a telltale sign of defensive wounds. Ultimately, it seems like she died from a stab wound to her neck, but she was stabbed multiple times on top of all that. There appeared to be a scuffle in the area, like she had struggled with her murderer, but unfortunately she wasn't able to get away. According to the Dateline episode, one of the ways that they were immediately able to ID her was by this charm bracelet she had on, and it was Detective Wayne Macy who was the one who went to tell the Ziegerts that she had been found, and he remained very attached to the case as long as it went on, even after he retired. They really didn't find much on the scene except for the buttons from her sweater, but they were able to get DNA off her body because of the sexual assault. Mind you, we're once again dealing with the early 90s, so DNA evidence wasn't what it was today. Luckily, though, it isn't like 1975, so they do run it through the system, and unfortunately, there's no match. So police decided to get a DNA sample from all of her male friends to see what they could rule out. And so here's where things get a little interesting, right? Naturally, Agawam is abuzz with gossip because it's kind of a small town, and they think a killer's on the loose. And it makes sense that this was a big deal because things like this do not happen in Agawam. It's normally a very safe place. I might have mentioned it in the Ashley Turniak episode because that took place in Agawam, but anytime I would hang out with my friend Ashley, who was also from Agawam and a guest on that episode on season 1 about Ashley Turniak, we'd go somewhere, me and Ashley, and I'd go to lock the car doors, and she'd be like, oh, don't worry about it, it's Agawam. Because bad things don't happen in Agawam. Meanwhile, I'm over here from Springfield being like, are you crazy? We have to lock the car doors. So you kind of get the picture. And one of the dangerous things about Agawam being such a small town is that gossip can get really damaging, which is especially true in the case of Ed Brigatti Jr. Ed actually lived with Lisa, Lisa's sister Lynn, and Lisa's boyfriend Blair at the time. Him and Blair were best friends, so obviously he was close to Lisa too. He was even one of the pallbearers at her funeral. But somehow people started talking as they do, and they pretty much decided that he was definitely Lisa's killer. The rumor was that him and Blair were having a secret relationship or together, or were secretly in love or something, and Lisa caught them sleeping together, and because of that, Ed killed her so no one would find out. Now that sounds like some bizarre Lifetime movie plot, and I'm not really sure where people came up with this whole thing, but I think a big reason why people started focusing on Ed was because his father was the retired police chief, and people started thinking that Ed was getting some kind of special treatment because of this. And even after DNA evidence cleared him, because it didn't match what was found on Lisa, it really didn't change people's minds. And unfortunately, he was still considered a person of interest because maybe he did know who killed her, or he had been an accomplice, so they couldn't fully rule him out, and therefore the public kept harassing him. They were calling his family restaurant where he worked and giving him death threats, which is kind of messed up. The problem with his alibi, though, was that he was working at the restaurant when Lisa was attacked, so people said that his family could have been covering up for him. Thankfully, though, the Ziegerts always stood by him and said that he was innocent, and it didn't really change people's minds, but it was nice that they supported him. And obviously, Ed tried to tell people that he wasn't involved, but that didn't really matter. In the eyes of the public, he was guilty, and they thought that for 25 years. After the DNA for everyone in Lisa's inner circle came back negative, the police started following every lead they could think of. They were trying hypnosis to try and have people remember partial license plate numbers. They tracked a vehicle to Russia with the help of Interpol to try and match tire tracks. And this led nowhere, but you kind of have to give Agawam PD some credit for that. And one of their big leads was checking the keys of any suspect that they brought in to be interviewed, because Lisa's apartment key wasn't ever found, and they assumed that the killer took it with them after they killed her. And they had a replica of the key, so they knew what it looked like. So they talk about this in the Dateline episode, and it's just absolutely wild to me. Basically, they had this guy they were interviewing, and they took his keys, and they found that one of the keys matched the Lisa's apartment key that was missing. So obviously they thought that they had their guy. But when they asked him about what's this key, he said, "Oh, it's just my apartment key." And so that was suspicious, obviously, but they had him go to his apartment and the key worked. Now, what happened is that his apartment complex and Lisa's were owned by the same management company, and apparently it's fairly normal to reuse the same keys and locks, which I think does actually sound kind of scary, but at the same time, who could possibly know that, and who would go and try a key in every single lock in some apartment complex in the hopes that they're going to get into someone's apartment? I doubt that happens. It seems kind of excessive, but it's still kind of a weird anecdote in this case. And that guy was cleared after that, obviously, because it was his apartment key. What also started to happen was a lot of women were reporting their boyfriends and significant others to police, and they had to track those tips down, even though a large majority of them were just ladies trying to get people in trouble because they were mad at them and there was no connection at all. Which is when Joyce Shara comes into the picture. So she and her attorney contacted the Agawam Police Department regarding her ex-husband, Gary Shara. They were actually going through a pretty messy divorce at the time, and she was currently living in Seattle, but he was still here in Massachusetts. She told police that he seemed very invested in Lisa's case and would run to the TV every time they mentioned it, which kind of weird. But he had absolutely no connection to Lisa or her family, and once police found out they were going through a divorce and that Joyce was an alcoholic, they sort of wrote her off as another spiteful wife who wasn't really being truthful. Even though she said he came home late that night of the murder and he had cuts on his hands and he was all hyped up, but they still kind of brushed her off. And the report did go on file, though, and in 2002, Gary actually did get brought in for an interview, but he basically spent the whole time saying, "Oh, my ex-wife is crazy, she's an alcoholic," and he refused to give his DNA. And you're within your rights to refuse that because they can't force you without a warrant, and they really didn't have a cause to get a warrant. They probably didn't even have enough to force a warrant on him anyway. His whole argument was that he didn't want to give his DNA because he was worried that someone could use his DNA to clone him. And so maybe police just thought he was kind of crazy too, and they sent him on his way. And he also very notably didn't touch anything on the table in front of him. Not a pen or the water that they'd placed there on purpose, because they hoped that he would touch something and they could test it. I'm not totally sure of how legal it is to do this, and I'm sure it's got to be, though. But technically, you're not consenting to them testing your DNA, but that was how they were trying to get him to do it. But he seemed to either know this or he just specifically didn't touch anything. So they didn't get his DNA, and they weren't too concerned about it, though, because, like I said, he wasn't really much of a suspect to begin with. So Gary Shara went on his way. At this point, years are passing with no real leads, and Unsolved Mysteries does a piece on the case, and it all turns up more people calling in tips, saying that it's our poor friend Ed Brigatti Jr. Things don't really go anywhere until 2015, where the new Hampden County District Attorney steps in. You've heard his name before. My guy, Anthony Gallooni. And he looks like a 1920s gangster, and I'm just like really here for it. And he also solved Danny Croto's murder, so like we stan. But anyway, he decides to team up with the state police, and they dig deeper into Lisa's case. They decide to try and do DNA phenotyping, and after a year and a half, they finally have a composite sketch of what the killer could look like. And it's a very broad sketch, because phenotyping can determine things like hair and eye color, race, and ancestry. So they come up with a male who was around 25 to 27 years old at the time of the murder, brown hair, brown eyes, fair skin, and a European ancestry, which probably honestly describes like half the men in Agawam at the time. But even though this doesn't look like Ed Brigatti, this like sketch I come up with, people are still calling it and saying that it's him. But like, is that really a surprise at this point? Because they're really gunning for him. But this is where things finally do take a turn. So Galuni decides to look into all the men who were questioned that refused to give DNA, because why not? They don't really have much else to go on. And so they're going to check that off the list. So there are 11 men that end up on their list of people to investigate. And on September 13, 2017, State Trooper Noah Pack, who was helping with the investigation, started to go and knock on doors and see if he could get in touch with any of these men. Gary Shar was one of them because he had refused to give his DNA in 2002, like I said. And Gary isn't home when he goes to see him, so he tells his roommate to just tell Gary that he stopped by and that he had some papers for him to look at down at the station. Well, this is when things really heat up, because 3 days later, Gary never contacted police, and they didn't hear anything from him until his girlfriend shows up at the Westfield Police Department, which is right next door to Agawam, by the way. The towns are next to each other. And she brings them these letters that Gary wrote, which are not only essentially a suicide note, but a confession to Lisa's murder. One was his last will and testament, and the other was an apology to Lisa's family. So here is some of the letter that Gary wrote, and this is from an article on Mass Life, which you can check out on my website. I've never been or even felt normal. From a very young age, I was fascinated by abduction and bondage. I could never keep it too far from my mind for long. On that fateful day, I let myself do something terrible. I've never forgiven myself, and that is only right. I also never did anything of the like again. I hated what happened. I despised myself. I thought of turning myself in hundreds of times over the years, but I am truly a coward. The letter was addressed to his girlfriend, and here's another excerpt. I've been dreading the day I'd need to write this letter for almost as long as I can remember. First off, I love you. I hope you never doubt that. Now's the hard part. You're going to find out some awful things about me today. They will tell you I abducted, raped, and murdered a young woman approximately 25 years ago. It's true. All of it. I had no intention of killing her when I grabbed her, but events spun out of my control, and in the eyes of the law, it's all the same. I have never regretted anything so much. I was young and headstrong and foolish, emphasis on the last part. I always knew it would one day catch up with me, and now it has. I received a text from my roommate last night that the state police were at my house with some important papers for me. That will be a warrant to take DNA, and that will send me away for life. I am still trying to decide, even as I write this note, if I have the courage for that, or if I will take the coward's way out. Either way, I apologize again. So much. And to Lisa's family, he ended the short letter with, I hope knowing who and knowing I am gone will give you some closure and peace. I am so truly sorry. Obviously, once police read it, it becomes a mad dash to find this guy because his letters basically sound like he's going to try and possibly attempt suicide. They trace his phone to a hospital in Connecticut, and in his car was another note that read, To whomever finds my body, I apologize for the psychological trauma incurred. Call Mass State Police. Thank you. GES. He had checked himself into the ER after taking a bunch of pills, but as far as I know, they didn't really do any damage because he survived. The police went to his apartment and were able to get DNA off his toothbrush, and as you can guess, it was a match. They arrested him for Lisa's murder, and he originally tried to plead not guilty, though I'm not sure how that could possibly make any sense. But on September 25th, 2019, he changed his plea to guilty in court, and he was charged with the first-degree murder of Lisa Ziegler and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The charges of kidnapping and rape were dropped because of the statute of limitations, but at least he still got life in prison regardless. He never really gave a reason as to why he killed Lisa, and after putting his DNA through CODIS, he never came up for any other crimes, so it's very possible that he never did commit another crime. But, like, how scary is that? Like, how many other Gary Shars are out there that are responsible for one single murder and they never come forward or they never commit another crime, so they never get caught? Obviously, in his letters, he seems actually sorry for what happened, but honestly, to me, he clearly wasn't all that sorry because he never came forward with the truth until he faced with the possibility of jail time. And even if this troubled him for years, him staying out of prison meant more to him than his guilt over what happened. Like many of these cases I talk about, it just kind of pisses me off because would Gary Shar have ever come forward if they never came after his DNA? Probably not. And my other thing is, blaming his murder on the fact that you had a obsession with abduction and bondage is way too simplistic for me. Because if that was the case, he probably could have, satisfied that in a much more consensual way than attacking an innocent girl. A person with some kinks isn't going to go and rape and murder someone on accident. I don't know. Maybe things did get out of his control and he didn't mean to kill Lisa, but he still probably meant to rape her, so obviously his intentions weren't pure. And who knows if this was actually meant to be directed at Lisa, or she just became someone who was there and was convenient for him. He claimed to not have known her, and there wasn't any discernible connection between them, so it seemed like a very random choice for him to have attacked her that night. And poor Joyce, his ex-wife, she died in 2014, so she never got to see the truth that came out, even though she was the one that was trying to get police to listen to her, and she was right this whole time. The Daylight episode is called The Music Box because she was gifted a music box by Gary around the time of the murder, and he said it came from Brittany's gift shop where Lisa worked. He told Joyce that some older lady sold it to him, but there wasn't an employee that matched the description he gave, which made Joyce believe that Gary took it the night of the murder and later gave it to her as a gift, which is pretty creepy, definitely ew. I do wonder if maybe he had been watching Lisa. She did say she felt like she'd been being watched, and maybe he went into the shop and did buy that music box as an excuse to come in and connect with Lisa, to contact her before the murder and maybe even look around the place. Maybe this was much more planned out than he ever said. What I do want to mention is on the Unsolved Mysteries blog about the case, there are some strange comments which came out before Gary actually came forward. I'll put a link on my website if you want to check them out, but there's multiple people under anonymous names that either said that the Agawam Police Department was covering up the truth, which you always get in cases like this, people thinking that, and another person who was adamant that Lisa was killed by more than one person. And they didn't mention Ed either, at all. Basically, the comment was saying something like, the evidence proves it was more than one person because they all took turns wearing Lisa's clothes. And it was posted by someone calling themselves Eyewitness Account, who possibly claimed to have seen something that night. Here are parts of some of the comments, and they're kind of a ride. I can't be charged because she was raped and murdered. I am female and can't be charged with rape or murder. I am only an innocent person who was put in a situation that would affect me for the rest of my life. The evidence speaks the truth. The police know who murdered her because they were at the crime scene when she was abducted. As an eyewitness account, I am mortified that the law enforcement as well as the Justice Department are not giving honest answers to the family of Lisa Marie Ziegert. I have been to the authorities. I have talked to Lisa's mom and contacted her brother. And if the police department had contacted everyone on the bowling list, there would not be an unsolved murder. Her blood and clothes worn by the suspects is everything to me. She thought me something no one else could. While there are many eyewitness accounts of what actually happened the night of April 15, 1992, some will not come forward with the information because of the group that is behind this horrific crime. I can only state as an eyewitness account that her blue peasant skirt, her purple sweatshirt, and at least a piece of her white embroidered shirt came back to the crime scene where she was abducted from. I have received many threats to keep my mouth shut, but I can't. The killers had boasted what they did to her, but I saw who was wearing the evidence, which is her blood and her clothes. Her blue peasant skirt tells the whole story. Her blood and clothes worn by her killers is all the evidence I need. She is the best teacher in the state of Massachusetts. She taught me how to name her killers. So, pretty bizarre, right? Basically, what this person is trying to say, I think, is that they were there the night of Lisa's murder, as were a number of other people, apparently, It involved the people who went to the bowling alley next door to the gift shop, and they bragged about what they did, and also that their DNA was on Lisa's clothing, but the police ignored it. Am I getting all that right? The only way this could possibly make sense is that Gary Shaw was part of this group, or maybe he wasn't the only person who hurt Lisa that night. But I find this incredibly hard to believe because in his letters he came off pretty cowardly and even attempted a possible suicide, so you think that he'd offer up anyone else involved to try and lessen his sentence. But Gary Shaw remains the only murderer of Lisa Ziegler, and there's no reason to assume otherwise. So that is Lisa's story, another one that I'm glad has finally been solved, and I'm sure has a lot of many other personal facets that we'll never know anything about. Like maybe Gary Shaw had been watching Lisa for a long time. But I'm glad that Lisa's family can finally have that closure, because I can't imagine spending decades wondering what happened to your loved one. And that poor freaking Ed Brigatti finally got cleared without a doubt. Another hats off to our man, Hampden County DA, Anthony Gallooni, because he ain't playing. And I respect that. I do recommend checking out my sources to get a better grasp of the case. And if you're interested, you can find all these on my website, which is wickedxcrime.wordpress.com. You can find me on social media at wickedxcrime on Instagram, wicked_crime on Twitter, and I'm also on Facebook too, which is the easiest place to contact me because I understand it the best. I'm still trying to figure out Instagram. I just really don't use it a lot. I have a pretty interesting lineup for this season, and it should be pretty fun, so you can look forward to a new episode every 2 weeks. Hopefully I'm going to try and be on a more regular schedule this time around. And the music in this episode is by some guy named Kevin MacLeod. Maybe you heard of him. As always, take care of yourself, look after yourself, go pet a cute animal, or maybe get a potted plant for that nice serotonin boost today. Thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.